book that you have a chapter on models of communication, which, by the way, was an excellent chapter. This is going to be a very brief synopsis of models of communication. I think you did a better job in your book than I will do today. So the mass communication research in the United States started in the 1920s with something called the Paine Fund studies. The Paine Fund was a charitable foundation that was interested in discovering the effects of motion pictures on children. And they did a series of studies on effects of motion pictures on children. And that research now is considered highly questionable. It's now thought that it was not particularly scientific, it was not particularly well informed. But that was the beginning of my discipline in the United States, was this research that was done on the basis of grants from the Paine Fund. They discovered what they came to call a hypodermic needle effect of communication. So, you know, when you go to the doctor to get a vaccine, the doctor vaccinates you and then you don't get, you know, whatever the disease happens to be that you're being vaccinated for, tetanus, for example. So the idea was that the audience was a mass audience, everybody was pretty much the same. They responded in uniform ways to media content, just in the same way that we as human beings, organic beings, respond in very much the same way to a tetanus vaccine. That's a very naive approach to communication, but it was the starting approach to communication. And then later research, and particularly one study that was done in Erie County, Ohio, that was examining people's use of media during the 1940 US presidential election. And the scholars were expecting to find this hypodermic effect. They were expecting that when people read editorials in the newspaper, they would vote the way the newspapers told them to vote. But they found that nothing like that actually occurred, that there was no hypodermic needle effect of media. And at that time that was very revealing. Now it seems self-evident, but it was not self-evident at that time. And what they discovered is that although media have effects, people's social context is more important than the media they use. And they came up with something that they called the two-step flow of communication, which also is naive, but it was a step in the right direction. And the two-step flow suggested that it's not your use of media, but it's your use of media in combination with your discussions with opinion leaders that help to shape your views. And different people can be opinion leaders on different topics. So for example, my wife loves motion pictures. She knows, I think, every motion picture that was ever done, who directed it, who was in the lead roles. I mean, she could go on Jeopardy. Are you familiar with Jeopardy? She could go on Jeopardy as a game show in the United States that's all based on knowledge of trivia. She could go on Jeopardy and win if it was about motion pictures. She knows so much. So she's an opinion leader when it comes to motion pictures. Friends and family talk to her about what motion pictures should I see, what motion pictures should I avoid. But you don't want to talk to her about what car you can buy. She's not an opinion leader on that. So the idea of the two-step flow is that my wife pays a lot of attention to media stories about motion pictures, and then she shares that information with her friends and family. Others, like one of my sons, who's a car nut, as we say in the United States, he's a fanatic about automobiles, reads a lot about automobiles, and he talks to his friends and family about that, so he's an opinion leader on that topic. The point is that media don't have a uniform, powerful effect. That effect is itself mediated by opinion leaders. So then this mythology grew in the United States that we had somehow gone from a powerful effects model to a limited effects model. And that too is naive. In reality, there are still limited effects models and powerful effects models of media, depending on a lot of different variables that have to do with context and psychology and motives for use and that sort of thing. So what we're trying to do with media mindsets is to discover things about the mindsets of audience members. And I don't even think the term audience is a good term anymore, and I'll get to that in a moment. So let's talk now about what we're doing. I talked about the fact that there's been this false dichotomy between a powerful and a limited effects model. The idea is, and if you read a lot of communication textbooks, they say in the early days in the 1920s up until 1940, there was a powerful effects model of media effects. And ever since then, it has been a limited effects model. The reality is there are still powerful effects theories. They're just more sophisticated theories than they used to be. And there are also limited effects theories. So what we thought would be better was, instead of looking at this false dichotomy, we thought it was better to organize mass communication theory or mediated communication theory around a set of basic models. And we found that almost every mediated communication theory falls into one of these basic models. So the first one is a model that looks at the media themselves, just looking at the media and the relationship between media and audience. And it does look at some degree at feedback, at the opportunity of audience members to say something back to the people who are communicating with them. And there are several theories, and I'm not going to go through every theory because it would take several hours and you don't want to sit here that long. But some examples, early persuasion theory, like the hypodermic needle model that I just talked about, is clearly falls into this model of looking at the effects of media themselves, just media in isolation from anything else, like content or social context or anything like that. The dependency theory, which was developed in the 1980s by Ulrich and DeFleur, is another theory that looks at the effects of media themselves. And what Ulrich and DeFleur say is that there is a dependency between media and audiences. We depend on media for information. Media depend on us for consumption because that's what drives their advertising revenue. But this model also says that media are more powerful in that relationship. They're more powerful than audience. But DeFleur and Ulrich don't look at content at all. They look only at people's dependency on media and how that dependency shapes media effects. Another example is the technological determinism of McLuhan and his professor, Harold Innis. Harold Innis talked about time-conquering versus space-conquering media. So a time-conquering media, for example, would be the oral tradition. The oral tradition is preserved over time. A space-conquering medium would be television. It's hard to preserve television over time. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. But it conquers space. You can disseminate television widely across space. And what Innis said is that societies are shaped by whether they use space-conquering or time-conquering media. McLuhan then built on that with this discussion of hot and cool media. Hot medium being something like a book or a newspaper, where it engages one sense, the visual sense, in a very heated way. I'm sorry I keep hitting this microphone. A cool medium would be something like television or the internet, which engages a lot of senses. It engages our sense of sight, our sense of hearing, our tactile senses. We tap on the keyboard and that sort of thing. These are all theories that are based on the media themselves. A second group looked at media content. So now we have the process of media professionals encoding information, creating content, which is then transmitted to an audience. Examples of this are the agenda setting theory of McCombs and Shaw. Shaw was one of my dissertation committee members. This is based on the idea that media don't tell us what to think, but they can tell us what to think about. So there's a real difference there. If there's a political discussion, and I've seen a lot of in your media right now, discussions about your upcoming election. Media don't have the power to tell you who to vote for, but they do have the power to tell you what the important issues are that you should be thinking about. And that's the essence of the agenda setting theory. The theory of framing goes a step further and says that media can shape the way we perceive things by how they frame the content. So a story in a newspaper that's on the first page is seen by the audience as more important than a story that's inside the newspaper. People in the media can frame stories by their selection of sources as well. So there are a lot of different, and their use of photographs and their use of graphics, all of these things can help to frame a story. And so this is another theory that looks at the content of media and how that content affects consumers. And then finally, cultivation theory talks about use of media over a long period of time. Gerbner and Gross say that media, they mainstream, that's their term, they mainstream certain ideas. So in the United States, there is a great deal of violence in media. If you watch American television, there are a lot of violent programs. If you watch American movies, there are a lot of violent movies. And what Gerbner and Gross hypothesized and demonstrated with their research is that if you watch a lot of this content, you come to think that the world is a more frightening place than it actually is. So if you compare people who use a lot of media that has violent content with people who don't, those who watch media that has a lot of violence are much more afraid than those who watch less media containing violence. So what they're saying is that it cultivates in people the idea that the world is a scary place. They actually call it the mean world hypothesis, that there are mean people out there. And you know, they've studied, they do content